Now, I don't know how your school would approach this. This is something that relates to the hashkafa of the school and your relationship with your co-teacher. But you may want to do something that's interdisciplinary. To me, this is really neat, if you could pull this off. Right? I talked before about Noach on the table. If you're familiar with the Ramban, the pirush of the Ramban associated with the size of the teva. Did anyone teach that Ramban? The Ramban says that the teva was not big enough to even hold the birds. Not even 10 tevas, I think he says, were necessary just for the birds alone. But if you think about it, the teva was actually only used, 1/3 of it was used for the animals, right? 1/3 for refuse, 1/3 for the people. It's not a lot of space, right? Think about the Bronx Zoo for a moment, or any big zoo you've been to. And they certainly don't have all the animals out there, right? Even though they're all compressed into these little compartments. I don't know exactly how it looked lamaisa on the teva. If they never got to stretch, I don't really know. But leave that detail aside for the moment. What was it like to be able to, how much food, for example, was necessary for the teva to work, for the animals to survive? What kind of nace did HaKadosh Baruch Hu provide? Right? We often take an experience in Chumash and we think about it the way we learned it when we were in first grade or second grade. Right? We still have this conception of Avram, the way we first conceived him, our conception of Sarah, the way we first conceived her, and we sort of forget that there's a lot of depth. You know, that's why I was so excited about teaching Bereshis again in 9th grade, because I had a mature audience to work with. We could get into it in a different way than you can get into it with a first grader. But even a first grader can understand a lot of these ideas. And we tend to, you know, they get a very basic appreciation and then we move on. But understand what the nace of the midbar was. Talk about what would it take. So for example, New York City is probably too large. I lived in other cities that had smaller populations. Let's take Chicago. Let's take 3 million people, which is the rough estimate of Klal Yisrael. 3 million people. How many Home Depots are there in Chicago? How many, I'll use the local grocery stores, Jewel and Dominic's are there in Chicago? Okay? How many, I don't know, Macy's and Nordstrom and whatever are there in Chicago? Quite a few. Quite a few, right? How often does your mother or father go shopping? Once a week, twice a week. How many cartloads of food do they bring home? And how many kids are you? 6 kids, 2 parents, whatever that number is. Now let's do the math, right? Let's figure out, well, what was the nace of the man? What was the nace of the ananim? What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu really provide for Klal Yisrael? So that they could what? That they could learn Torah, that they could connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But you're doing the math, and you're understanding it in real terms. It takes what already seems like a pretty sophisticated nace, right? They do appreciate that the man was quite special, but to that degree, to this amount, for this many people, for this many years, right? What did they really benefit? How would your life change if you were able to eat man every day, okay? And not have to change your clothes very often, and your shoes would remain just fine the way they are, and you wouldn't have to worry about shelter, and everything, all of your material needs were provided for you, right? It's a whole different conversation. So you may or may not require the interdisciplinary piece, but if you can work together with the general studies teacher, and they can help you, especially if they have the right hashkafas, and they can help you with some of these details, wouldn't that be nice? That would take your learning, and for those of you who deal with the issue, I don't know if anyone in this room has this problem, of validating limudei chol to some of your students. Right? For those who think they'll never use general studies because that's not what they're there to learn, that you may have that in certain contexts amongst the boys, typically more so than the girls. Here would be a nice way by which to integrate things for the purpose of they can appreciate. So it's a different idea and a different approach. Okay? I talked about analyzing the teva. You know, you could have somebody who chronicles the story. You could have a zoologist talk about some of the animals that are there. Again, this may not be what you want to do. It might be what your co-teacher chooses to do. You know, the types of food they need, how big the teva has to be, or how large would the teva really need to be. Take them on a field trip to the zoo. How large would the teva really need to be in order for it to hold all the animals? I don't know, but quite large, I would think. Okay. The notion of millions surviving for 40 years in the midbar, we talked about that. Different roles that you could utilize. All of these things are just different ways to engage the tummy.